folks at Switchback. As you may know, I went on my first snowshoeing trip recently, and I wanted to go over with you the things I did wrong and the things I did right. Any gear that I'm mentioning, I'm going to try to put links down in the description below. Let's start with what I did right, and let's be real, I did a lot right. Here I am to tell the tale. I watched a lot of videos on YouTube and did a lot of research and took nothing as gospel necessarily. You know, there's more than one right way to do things, but it's really nice to see a variety of people. I chose a route that I had taken before. I could have chosen one that I had taken more than once, but realistically, you know, this was one that was going to work. It had cell reception. I knew, you know, I had a sense of the terrain and I knew it wasn't going to be terribly far. I upgraded my stove before I went. Usually I'll use a canister stove. I typically use the MSR Pocket Rocket Deluxe, but I decided to go with a Whisper Light for this one. And I, again, did a lot of research. I decided to go with an older model of it, and I was able to find one for half the price, used and thankfully locally. So I was able to set it up with the person who was selling it, got it fired up. White gas stoves do a lot better in cold temperatures than a canister stove. And that's because the isobutane, the mix that's in those canisters doesn't do as well under those cold temperatures. It doesn't get evaporated the same way as white gas, kerosene, or other gases that go on one of those white gas stoves. One of the things I needed to use that stove for was melting snow for water, and so I bought a larger pot. I usually use a 750 ml titanium pot, but I decided to get an 1100 ml because, you know, just having a larger capacity is really nice when you're trying to melt snow. I made sure that I updated my campfire permit. So in California, every year you need to get a new campfire permit if you plan on using a stove out in the backcountry. Whether or not you plan on actually building a fire, you need to have one for a stove. I decided to upgrade to some wool base layers and some wool boot socks. So I'd already had some darn tough wool socks, but I wanted to get some thicker boot socks because I knew that they would be warmer. I wanted them taller. I knew that something thick would be a good idea. And in my research, I've seen that wool base layers, especially if they're not skin tight, do a better job in the cold. I took a free avalanche awareness course, and I'll put the link down in the description below. It's through the Northwest Avalanche Center. And if you have zero avalanche experience, this is a really great jumping off point just to give you some awareness and make you aware of what to look for, you know, what sounds you might hear, things that, you know, can be red flags and help you avoid a tragic situation. And with that, a disclaimer, I would not go into avalanche terrain alone, ever. There were a couple of spots that were treacherous where I was, and I go into that in my trip report video. But do not ever go into avalanche terrain by yourself, and certainly without avalanche training and avalanche gear. I also downloaded an avalanche app so that I could watch the avalanche conditions. And since we had just had this atmospheric river and all of these feet and feet and feet of snow, I knew that the avalanche risk was probably fairly high, at least immediately after. So I was monitoring the trend of it as the risk got lower. I also watched the weather very closely. And again, we had just gotten all this snow, but thankfully the day that I was going out, or the couple of days that I was going to be out there, the weather was gorgeous and there was supposed to be minimal wind for that Saturday. The wind was supposed to pick up later on Sunday. I made some strings with carabiners to stake out my tent, which I ended up not using, but when I do use those another time, I will show you what I do. But if you're curious about it, Justin Outdoors is who I got the idea from. And the idea is that you can loop it around a stick and bury that, and then that way you just unclip the carabiner and the string comes out, and you don't have to try to, you know, break out whatever your stake is or whatever in the ground or in the snow. I knew in advance my pace was not going to be fast. I knew I'd be going at least under a mile an hour because I'm not usually even fast, and then snowshoeing and fluffy snow, and I knew it was not going to be a fast trek. Again, I also knew that there would be cell reception, but I still took my Garmin InReach just in case as a backup. Some people will choose to snowshoe without poles. I cannot imagine doing this trip without them because as it was, I already fell enough. They saved me from several falls, but trekking poles with snow baskets, which are critical, especially in fluffy snow, highly, highly recommend. I also bought a pole clinometer sticker, which is to look at avalanche terrain, gauging the angle of the slope. So, and you can angle, or you can check it out from any direction, whether you're looking up at it, down at it, from the side. And I practiced with it a little bit before my trip, probably could have practiced with it a little bit more, but it was really cool to have that and kind of get an idea of what I was going into. And again, I'll put a link to that down in the description. I took backup water treatment, which saved me. And again, I'll go into that into the trip report. In short, I ran out of fuel, thankfully was able to melt water, but really needed to treat it in order for it to be safe to drink. And it may have been fine because it was fresh snow and I was scraping off the top layer, but it really wasn't a risk I was willing to take. For that water, I also used a Nalgene as opposed to a hydration reservoir, which is what I would typically use. But when it's going to be as cold as it was, it got down to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a good idea to have a bottle rather than a tube that's going to freeze. When you're out in the snow like that, if you have to poop, you can't exactly dig a cat hole. And so I brought a wag bag, which thankfully I did not end up having to use, but it was certainly a wise thing for me to be carrying. Another thing that I brought but did not use was stuff to build a fire. And there really wasn't a way to do it. I suppose if I had really been dedicated to it, I probably could have made it work. But, again, all this fresh snow had fallen, so any downed wood was buried. And getting near any trees is really dangerous, especially with that much snow, because you have what are called tree wells. And what that is the heat of the trunk of the tree melts the snow around it. And so there's like this hole around the trees. And it's really easy to fall into that if you're not careful, and it's really challenging to get out. And so I made sure that I set up camp far away from any trees and did not go anywhere near any of those trees. But ultimately this made, building a fire really impossible. I wasn't going to haul a bunch of firewood up there. And I'm not sure that even setting it up on top of that much snow was going to happen, and I certainly wasn't going to dig down to the ground. I also decided at the last minute to leave my Crocs behind. I had planned on, I like to have camp shoes when I'm out backpacking, and I debated whether or not to bring them. I was going to bring a pair of Crocs, and ultimately, with how much I was post-holing, I'm really glad I did not bring them. If you're getting any value out of this, be sure to like and subscribe. It does help the channel and helps me to share this information with more people. Next, let's talk about what I did wrong and what I could have done better. It was really hard for me to test gear in proper conditions before going. Ultimately, this kind of was a tester trip, but if at all possible, I would really recommend getting a thorough test before you're out a couple of miles from your vehicle in deep snow in the cold like that. I had brand new boots. I had tried them out one other time in the snow, and thankfully they were comfortable. And I had tried them with my snowshoes because the first time I took my snowshoes out, which this was only really the second time I spent more than about 10 minutes on them, I used my Merrell Moab boots, which are great for hiking, but really not great for snowshoeing. And they wet out and they were uncomfortable and they killed my Achilles. So I was really hopeful that this was going to go well. And I was prepared to turn around if it was painful, like it was with the Merrell boots. Thankfully, it worked out well, but that was luck to some degree. I had worn the Bridger boots around the house a bit. I didn't want to take them out in case they were uncomfortable, but they worked out really well for me on this trip. I really should have called the U.S. Forest Service and asked about parking. Because of all of the snow that had fallen, there were very tall snowbanks on both sides of the road, including filling the parking lot that you would normally park at this trailhead. And as a result, everyone was illegally parking, myself included, but most of them were not there overnight, and so they did not get towed like I did. Had I been able to choose the date more carefully, which again, thankfully the date that I chose was a few days after all of these storms, But it would have been a good idea to go a little later after these storms when the snow was not so fluffy, because I was post-holing like crazy. It was absolutely exhausting, and I had to hope to God that it was tracked out. And thankfully, again, most of it was, but I didn't know. I was going in kind of blind. I used my usual Amazon pouch to heat my food. Most trips, this totally does the trick. This trip, no way. My food was absolutely cold every time I went to go eat, which, I mean, I only had two like quasi hot meals, but they were definitely cold by the time that I got them, even when I put my dinner inside of my backpack to try to add insulation. So lesson learned, I love my Amazon pouches. I hoard them like crazy, and they're great for the summer, the shoulder seasons, but they're not good for the deep of winter. I should have left my house earlier so that I could get to the trailhead sooner. I got there about 1 p.m. and again, this is winter, so it's not like I have light until 9 p.m. I had light until about 5:30. So it would have been a good idea for me to get there earlier, leave the house earlier, pack up earlier. I tend to run late for things, just FYI, I'm that person. But I got there about 1 o'clock. It would have been a good idea to get there maybe even an hour earlier would have made a difference. I was unsure how much fuel I needed, and ultimately I ran out. I also could have practiced with my stove more, and I could tell the first time I used it out on the trail that it was, that I needed a little bit more practice. Thankfully, the next time I used it went a lot better. But again, I did run out of fuel, and I had enough to melt snow in the morning, but I did not have enough to boil it and make it safe. And so I had to, thankfully, I had my Aquamira drops with me, so I was able to use those to treat it and make it safe to drink, but that also meant no hot breakfast and no coffee. I'd love to hear your favorite lesson out of these down in the comments below. And if you want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon now. And so I'll put that link down in the description. And of course, like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye. Or basically, woo, shoot. That wasn't the plan. Don't throw your coffee. That's sacrilege anyway.